Welcome to our Zoom session organized by the Graduate Institute of Yaşar University. This is going to be the second and the last of this year's talk. And today we are going to be listening to our Ahmet Süner Hoca, and the title of his talk is Antigone, Just Governance in the EU, the Value of Dialogical Reason, or Phronesis. Let me briefly introduce him, although you all know him. As you all know, Ahmet Süner is an assistant professor in English language and literature at Yaşar University, Izmir. He has 2 PhDs, one in comparative literature from the University of Southern California, and the other is in structural engineering from Duke University. His publications include essays on the work of Freud, Charlotte Bronte, Walpole, Radcliffe, Carroll, Kafka, Stevenson, Stoker, Polidori, Matthew Lewis, Sartre, Wittgenstein, and Heidegger. His work has been published in international venues such as 18th Century Studies, Oxford German Studies, College Literature, Journal of European Studies, Renaissance Papers on Language and Literature, Studio Neophilologica, Moderne Sprache, Children's Literature in Education, Atlantis, Studio Phenomenologica, and Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences. His research interests are Gothic literature, literary criticism, philosophy of language, literature, and film. He's currently leading an EU-funded Jean Monnet module on the role of literary and artistic fictions in building values for the future of the Union. So we are with you, Ahmet. The floor is yours.
Hi, welcome to my talk. I'm going to be reading it. I'm going to be reading it as slowly as possible. I've got some quotes from Antigone, which I'm sharing on the screen. Please try to follow those quotes because I'll be referring to them. I'll be, commenting on them. This is part of my project course, the project course that's on the values prescribed in the EU and how to draw a bridge between the field of literature and those values and the politics in the EU. I'll be using Antigone as an example for drawing that kind of a bridge between literature and the EU. And I'll be now reading my talk. So please, if you have questions, please, I'd like to take them at the end of the course, at the end of the talk. I'd like to get started now with my talk. And the talk is called Antigone, Just Governance in the EU, the Value of Dialogical Reason, or Phronesis. I'll be telling you what Phronesis is, shortly during the talk. All right. There's much mention in Turkey regarding what the EU is and what it represents. It has always been a point of contention whether Turkey must be facing toward the EU or away from the EU. We in Turkey have been wondering whether we should be part of the EU, whether we should reform ourselves institutionally, societally, even perhaps individually, as a future member of the EU or a perennial candidate. This debate is usually shaped around a particular perception of Europe, one which we might deem our perception or the Turkish perception, a perception that inevitably results in a tension, if not a dichotomy between us, those from Turkey, and them, the Europeans. Obviously, one cannot define Europeanness, just like one would not be able to define Turkishness, but there are ways in which institutions, European or otherwise, could be defined from both the inside and the outside. And the EU has done just that. It has come up with a self-definition. It has opted for a self-definition based on particular values, including democracy, justice, equality, freedom, and human dignity. It's a matter of debate whether these values are actually at work, whether these values are present or actually practiced, or whether this discourse of values, so prominent in the Union's foundational documents, such as the Lisbon Treaty and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, is deployed to provide a roadmap for the future of the EU. Given that there are significant variations across Europe regarding the adherence of individual nations to particular values, as evidenced by European value surveys, the values prescribed in EU documents should perhaps be thought of as belonging to a liminal time, a time in between that has its bearings both in the present and the future. This time is then one of becoming, in which the Union has been shaped and is to be shaped gradually, tactically, institutionally, and individually. Looking at one of the most prominent values prescribed in the EU documents, for instance, democracy, core value, becomes that point of communal interest whose becoming and not achievement or finalization has been and will be momentous for the entire Union. The premise of this paper is simple yet ambitious. Arts in general and literature in particular are among the most important cultural sources of value for the becoming of the European Union. Working at the intersection between politics and literature, this paper builds on the premise of approaching works of literature as inspirational sources of value for the becoming of the Union. More particularly, it intends to show how a seminal literary text from ancient Greece, that is Sophocles' Antigone, might be thought of as contributing to the very idea of democracy and justice by making us reflect on how particular judgments related to government must be made and evaluated based on the use of reason. Consequently, the paper desires to display the extraordinary potential of literary and artistic texts, Antigone in this particular instance, which in transcending the time and space of their original production, continue to contribute to the discourse of values that shape not only the European Union, but also other political unions, including our very own Turkey. Indeed, I read Antigone as a text that responds to the current state of justice and democracy in the world that we currently live in imparting a contemporary relevance to Sophocles' tragedy, I contend that works of literature in general, and Antigone in particular, are not antiquated fictions that reflect the mores of a distant time. They're potential sources of value for the world in the making. Antigone motivates us to think about the preconditions of good governance, helping us to specify what ways of thinking, reasoning, and acting we need to value in our own administrations. More specifically, the play is a reflection on the good use of reason and a prophetic warning about the need for a non-solitary kind of thinking, reasoning in government. A prominent point of contention in the play, such reasoning is repeatedly addressed, debated, and reformulated through the concept of phronesis, as seen in the dramatic contrast between Creon's and Human's ways of political reasoning. The play underscores the necessity of a counseling, listening reason, or what I call dialogical phronesis, as a prerequisite for good governance, and by implication, a prerequisite for a democratic democracy. I will now proceed by looking closely at some of the key passages from Antigone that suggest that catastrophic foibles, including those political ones in our democratic regimes, might result from ignoring or not valuing dialogical phronesis, which involves non-solitary reason and independent, free-thinking counsel, especially the kind that issues from those repressed margins not allowed to speak openly. I will start with a caveat. One might object that Sophocles' play does not technically take place in a democracy and hence might be irrelevant to the question of democracy or democratic values. Alternatively, referred to as a tyrant or an autocrat in the play, Creon rules Thebes with a firm hand or perhaps with a tight fist that will not tolerate any opinion other than his own. As a brief counter-argument, I could point out the excessive vagueness of our present conceptions of democracy. What we value as democracy is nothing but a set of positive qualities predominantly related to the kind of justice and equality we have come to discern in exemplary democratic governments. The substantive democracy, never that much of a substance, essence, or presence to begin with, has been overtaken, superseded, or to use a very Hegelian term, sublated, aufgehoben, by the adjective democratic, describing the quality of ruling and being ruled in a just and equal manner. The democratic is now at a considerable distance from democracy, and our times might be characterized by the dramatic and excruciatingly painful rift between the two, democracy and the democratic. Indeed, we seem to have arrived at a curious time when being for democracy is not at all the same as being democratic. Unfortunately, I do not have the time to pursue this philosophical line, which, based on the rift between the substantive democracy and the adjective democratic, is also a philological one. Rather, I will point out simply and with confidence in my audience that they will recognize something empirically self-evident, that many a democracy in the world, including some in the current European Union, has given way or is on the way to giving rise to autocracy and tyranny, if not to oligarchy and kleptocracy, all done in the vacuously celebrated name of democracy. We now live in a world where it's no longer redundant to desire a democratic democracy. I would more generally argue that the frequently empty talk about the values of democracy must be replaced with the more sensible talk about democratic values, whose ultimate rigor is to be sought in the concepts of equality, justice, and freedom. While it would be a stretch to view Antigone as a direct reflection on democracy, there is no question that the play is a forceful commentary on justice, and to the extent that it's about just governance, it's also a commentary on democratic values, or more precisely, a commentary on the democratic. Now, phronesis is what I'll be talking about right now. As I've already pointed out, Antigone highlights the necessity of a non-solitary kind of phronesis, which might be roughly translated as good use of reason or wisdom, especially in those acts of governance where justice must be observed. In underscoring the non-solitariness of this kind of wisdom, I'm also pointing out its multiplicity and diffusiveness. The good use of reason in Antigone is not to be localized as issuing from just one place or just one ruler, conceived as an authoritative subject, an autocrat, or even worse, a tyrant. The play is about the administrative failure of Creon, the autocrat, who refuses to submit his thinking, reasoning to the multiplicity of other voices while pretending to be the very seat of reason itself. As a ruling king, a subject above all subjects, Creon views himself as the highest, that is the majestic and sublime representative of reasoning thought. Let me now comment briefly on phronesis. The word is a noun that derives from the verb phronein, as you can see on the screen, which is the actual word that is used in the play. There are two senses of the word, a more neutral and mundane sense that refers to the act of thinking and reasoning, and a more ideal sense that refers to thinking and reasoning in a wise and prudent way, the two senses establishing a continuum. I would like to remind my audience that it is the noun version of the word, phronesis, that proved to be more popular as a philosophical concept, both in ancient Greece and today. There is even a philosophical journal that is titled Phronesis. Both Plato and Aristotle write about phronesis, describing and prescribing it according to their characteristic ways of thinking. Plato engages with the more ideal sense of phronesis, thinking of it as an elevated, higher kind of reason associated with intellectual abilities. Aristotle considers phronesis as one of the four fundamental virtues, arete, but also engages with the more mundane sense, relating it to our experience in the practical matters of the world, and hence imparting to it the quality of being practical. Evidently, Aristotle's use of the word has become the more popular of the two, and phronesis is therefore often translated as practical wisdom or prudence. In this presentation, I will only concentrate on the particular way Antigone, the play, conceives phronesis, which it predominantly alludes to through the verb phronein, as well as through a host of semantically and morphologically related other words, phrenas, phronema, and I will translate the infinitive to phronein, to phronein, as the good use of reason, and less frequently as wisdom. Now, let us remember the plot. In a battle that determines the fate of the city of Thebes, a battle that's called 7 against Thebes, Antigone's two brothers take opposing sides and kill each other. Creon the king deems one brother, Eteocles, the one that defends the city, a hero, and the other that fights it, Phronesis, a traitor. While one brother will be buried according to holy rites performed for the dead, the corpse of the other will remain exposed to the elements like that of an animal. In the very name of reason, Creon arrives at a dichotomous judgment on the value of dead bodies, elevating one to glory and martyrdom, while reducing the other to banishment and abjection. Antigone protests, resists, and defies Creon's judgment. It does not matter whether one brother was on the side of the city-state or the other was an enemy of it. During the fateful battle, the same just rites must be observed for both of them. Performing the just rites, she secretly buries the exposed corpse of her brother. When the guards find out about the scandalous act of defiance, they report it to Creon, who orders that Antigone be imprisoned in a tomb-like cell. A catastrophe follows. Antigone hangs herself, and her despairing fiancé, Human, who is also Creon's son, commits suicide by stabbing himself. Creon's wife also kills herself when she learns about her dead son. Creon's judgment and his subsequent verdict results in the destruction of Antigone, his own son and wife. At first sight, it seems that Creon is the one that is on the side of phronesis. He has reasoned, judged, and acted. He has made a decision to the end of establishing a sense of order in the city of Thebes after the fateful war that pit brother against brother. While we find his decision against Polynices' burial unjust, we may still have to concede that he's not entirely unreasonable in making a political distinction between the two brothers, especially in the way he honors the memory of Eteocles, who fought for the city. As opposed to Creon, Antigone seems not to be acting on reason, but on something more akin to feeling or intuition. Her defiance is based not on the worldly life of the city-state, but on metaphysical and cosmological considerations beyond this world, its mortal polities and politics. She says, for the rights of the dead, rights that issue from the gods and not from mere mortals. Her justice appears not to be the calculated outcome of reasoned thinking, yet is still a true instance of justice, one I would like to call self-evidential. If Creon is the one who errs in judgment, should we not then deem the play a scathing critique on the limitations of reason with which Creon purportedly acts and with respect to which Antigone's intuitive justice appears ideal? Is not the play about the uselessness of thinking reasoning when it comes to matter of justice and by implication matters of governance? Not really. Sophocles' play is emphatic that Creon's reason is flawed without positing Antigone's intuition as an alternative. We must therefore look at the play as a critique of Creon's failure in thinking reasoning, as well as an attempt to formulate the right and just use of reason. Sophocles repeatedly stresses the importance of Phronesis by placing it at the center and more strikingly at the very end of his play. The very last lines uttered by the chorus after the catastrophe is a striking claim on the nature of Phronesis. Okay, so I'm looking at the quote right now. Wisdom, or tophronin, is provided as the chief part of happiness, and our dealings with the gods must be in no way unholy. The great words of arrogant men have to make repayment with great blows, and in old age teach wisdom. Again, the wisdom referred to here is tophronin. The passage underscores phronin as its chief value at the core of the play, negated and destroyed by the tragedy's catastrophic ending. The quote, however, hints that the achievement of wisdom is conditional on the achievement of holy justice. It would be unholy to lack phronesis in our dealings with gods, which implies that the chorus regards wisdom as partially otherworldly. True phronesis, and not the kind that Creon has exemplified, refers to a semi-religious practice that guides proper, elevated, and godly conduct essential for happiness, both in private and public life. Being proud, indeed overproud, hyperaphon, and arrogant, Creon had to receive a lesson, here figured as a lesson of great blows, that teaches him something about the true godly use of reason. One must not be too proud in their discourse, loi, of justice. Mortal wisdom leads to happiness only when divine justice is attained. With this quote in mind, I would like to propose two moments regarding the use of reason. First, the moment of worldly phronesis associated with our mental capacities as mortal human beings. And second, the moment of justice associated with divinity and godliness. True phronesis is the one that can rise to the second moment. The precise nature of such phronesis, however, would remain vague in isolation from the rest of the play, where Sophocles deploys the negative example of Creon and the ambiguous example of Antigone, two examples that help illustrate it. Creon is clearly depicted as lacking in the virtue of phronesis, primarily because, as I will attempt to explain, his thinking, reasoning is monological. It's more ambiguous with Antigone. She does not so much think than act. in interpreting the play's conflict, we tend to take Antigone's side and deem her a symbol of justice and just resistance, but we hardly deem her a symbol of good thinking or reasoning. We may even see her self-evident sense of justice as an inverted reflection of Creon's monological reasoning, and a certain level of ironical mirroring holds between Creon and Antigone, as they both insist on the soundness of their thinking and judging, and neither of them hearkens the word of the other. If we see the play as a lesson on the good use of reason, or phronesis as a way of attaining justice, it would be more sensible to start with the negative example of Creon and to discuss what there is to object to in his thinking, reasoning. In this presentation, I will not have time to look at the ambiguous example of Antigone, who does not so much make an appeal to reason as to her own intuition and justice, intuition of justice, while I would refrain from describing Antigone as lacking in wisdom. We may perhaps find some merit in the wisdom of her sister Ismene, who argues that breaking Creon's law would be politically imprudent, and that Antigone should desist from her oppositional acts. But it's not the cautious Ismene whom we side with. It is Antigone's sense of justice and resistance that we admire. We hardly expect Antigone to be wise. We want her to be just and defiant. It's a different story for Creon, however. Unlike Antigone, Creon errs in his sense of justice, which is entirely probable in our mortal world, as being mortals, we all do. This is because he has erred in using his reason for the attainment of godly justice, or he has not made good use of reason. Ironically, it's Creon who seems at first closest to reason or phronene, as evidence in his frequent references to it in his speeches. However, it's his reason is a kind of self-referential, monological kind of thinking reasoning that the play critiques. The real or truthful phronesis evoked in the play, especially in Human's speeches, is very different from the one found in Creon's ample self-justifications. Refusing to take into account any other opinion than his own as just or right, Creon the king assumes he makes better use of reason than anyone else in the city-state. The language he uses displays his absolute convictions. This is my phronema, my thought and will, and never will I, this is a quote from the play, this is my will, and never will I allow the traitor to stand in honor before the just. The will referred to in the translation is more precisely an instance of the use of reason or phroneme in the original, a forceful and firm thought, phronema, that has become a commanding will. As the new king of Thebes, Creon asserts his willful thought in front of the chorus, which stands for the council of the Theban elders. He does this in a categorical way that does not leave any room for opposition. His will immediately turns into law, being determined within a solitary instance of thinking, reasoning, and without any mediation through the world. In this instance, the advice or the counsel of others. He will forbid Phronesis' burial on the ground of the latter's treason and punish with death anyone who disobeys his law. Not only does Antigone's act of burying her brother violate the king's law, but it also runs against the chorus, who has hitherto approved and obeyed the king's will. When Antigone is brought before him for having violated his decree, Creon appears astonished by the young woman's audacity. And this is the third quote. Creon says, "Are you not ashamed that your beliefs differ from theirs?" And the belief is actually referred to as a way of thinking, or phronesis. How may Antigone think, reason, or phroneme, or use her reason differently from the rest of the society, defying first his authority, and second, the approving public opinion. Just as he cannot bear to hear any opinion than his own, Creon does not admit the possibility that Antigone might have a different thought than the chorus's public one. Antigone responds to Creon's words with the use of phronein again, but the phronesis she appeals to still lacks any necessary measure of the other or mediation through difference. You appear, okay, this is Antigone speaking, quote number 4. You appear to be thinking right to these ones, whereas I to the other ones. And the word phronein is used there, to be thinking right. Antigone is reasoning, or phronein, following the law of the dead, in contrast to Creon, whose reason dwells on the living. There seems little, if any, communication between these ones and the other ones. Antigone and Creon stand in absolute opposition. Creon will not listen to Antigone. There is no room for the thought of others in his thinking reasoning. And as I will discuss in more detail in the following, his reason is impervious to the counsel of the other. This counsel comes in different forms: pieces of advice, dire warnings, appeals to the facts of the case, appeals to pity and mercy, and as may be expected in a myth-inspired work of ancient Greece, supernatural forebodings and omens. Indeed, Creon verbally attacks all who are there to counsel him, not just Antigone, but also Human, his son, Tiresias, the seer and the messenger. Here is a most revealing warning from Human, Creon's son. Quote number 5, sorry. The one who thinks that he alone is wise, or phronein monos, that in speech or in mind he has no equal, such a soul, when laid open, is found empty. Phronein monos, or monos phronein, refers to the monological reasoning or reason that I've been referring to in my description of Creon. Human generally observes that thinking reasoning alone is a serious flaw in every citizen as they go about the business of life. But the particular context suggests that monological phronesis is an even more serious affair when it belongs to those who represent authority and government. Human dramatically calls out Creon's flaw in not taking into consideration anyone else's thoughts. His soul or psyche is found empty, and the emptiness here connotes what we have come to associate in our contemporary political idiom with an echo chamber. Creon lacks what might be called dialogical phronesis, the kind of reasoning that takes into account or involves a measure of the others, a measure. And here I use the word measure in the multiple senses of the word, as an act of sizing up one's own reason against the other, of judging the relative importance of opinions, and coming up with properly reasoned ways of acting. Sophocles' play is the tragedy of the kind of governor and governance that insists on the mono in speech and mind, unwilling to take the measure, which means the counsel of the other. It might be argued that, similar to Creon, Antigone has also failed to listen to others, being excessively self-convinced in her defiant act. Such a flaw might perhaps be overlooked or forgiven, given that Antigone is only a citizen, one among many. The case of Creon, the king having the same flaw, however, is a much more serious affair. Monos phronein must not be tolerated in the leader of Thebes, or in any leader for that matter. Dialogical phronesis is hence posited in the play as a sine qua non characteristic of a political leader. It's true that all citizens, in fact, all individuals, must be able to think, reason in a just manner. But this applies even more to the politician or leader whose actions dramatically affect the life that they represent, affect the people that they represent. Creon does not listen to the counsel of Antigone, nor does he hear the counsel of others, simply because the others are afraid to speak. As Antigone forcefully notes, and this is a quote from Antigone, or all here will admit that they approve what Antigone says about Creon, if fear did not grip their tongues. But tyranny, blessed with so much else, has the power to do and say whatever it pleases. The fear, phobos, has shut in the tongue. The fear has shut in the tongue. Creon has terrorized the chorus so much that they cannot utter any word of opposition, nor can they openly approve Antigone's opposing words. Creon's subsequent punishment of Antigone, her imprisonment in a windowless cell, reverberates with the shutting in of her tongue or speech. No opposing or questioning word of counsel will reach Creon's ears. Antigone is ironic when she refers to Creon's bliss, eudaimonia, which is the monological bliss of a tyrant. The speech of the other has been shut off and away, and Creon can do and say, lein, as he pleases. Let us not forget that Creon's Phronesis is a patriarchal one that shuts away the voice of Antigone, and in fact, all women. Indeed, Creon considers all opposition to his word a faulty use of reason, a degradation of reason to femininity. Here's a brief excerpt of his tirade to his son Haman, whose reason Creon thinks is ruled by Antigone, his fiancée. Never then banish your reason, Phronesis, for pleasure on account of a woman, knowing that this embrace soon becomes cold and brittle, an evil woman to share your bed and home. Reduced to the pleasures of intimate life and domesticity, women are not part of the life of polity or politics. They have no business in the workings of rule and power, and by extension, no business in the workings of reason. This is primarily the reason why Antigone or Ismene will not be listened to. It must be emphasized that it's not only women, but also all other opposing parties that Creon considers to be lacking in reason, including the messenger, who represents lower and perhaps working classes, and the seer, Tiresias, who represents the godly council that will not be subjected to Creon's will. While Creon gives abundant and often sexist advice to Haman, his son, it's implied that he will not, as the patriarch, take counsel from a younger member of his family. In Creon's natural equation between power and reason, wisdom cannot emerge from any subordinate, whether this latter be a woman, a son, a younger person, a worker, or even an oracle. Haman, a brave son that protests the father's injustice, must observe a fine line between voicing his political opposition and observing obedience to his father. His softly sobering counsel, which I will look at more closely in the following, gives us a more precise sense of the true Phronesis the play wants us to reflect upon. This is how Haman begins his attempt to persuade Creon. And this is the 8th quote. Father, the gods implant reason, Phronesis, in man, the highest of all things that we call our own. For my part, to state how you are wrong to say those things is beyond my power and my desire, although another man too might have a useful thought. Haman is making an appeal to reason, Phronesis, by mentioning its divine provenance, the gods. The word used to refer to reason, Phronesis, is akin to Phronesis and is within the spectrum of the multiple words denoting the varying states of reason with different qualifications, here suggesting a reason coupled with perception and imagination. This reason is the highest value of mortals and their highest prized possession, as long as it can rise to the heights of its godly source. Yet Creon has erred. This reason is wrong. That is not upright or orthos, or using the divine metaphor, not high enough. The highest reason must be constituted with the contribution of others who might say something useful, or more precisely, something good, or kalos. As opposed to the solitary workings of autonomous reason, what is being proposed here is an ethics of an inclusive reason that listens and learns from others. But which others? Human continues. This is a nice quote. For dread of your glance forbids the ordinary citizen, Adri Dimoti, to speak such words as would offend your ear. But I can hear these murmurs in the dark, how the city moans for this girl, saying, no woman ever merited death less, who, when her own brother had in bloody battle, would not leave him unburied to be devoured by savage dogs or by any bird. Does she not deserve to receive golden honor? Such is the rumor shrouded in darkness that silently spreads. Such is the rumor shrouded in darkness that silently spreads. Creon, the leader and the king of Thebes, has spread fear with his terrifying eye and banished the speech of ordinary citizens. There's only murmurs and rumors, and these oppositional speech acts take place in the dark, hidden from his commanding sight. Haman has become the very messenger of these murmurs. Creon must now take the counsel of his son, and through him, the passage implies, he must also take the counsel of those repressed voices uttered in the dark. Note that these voices are referred to as a dark speech or eremifatis, a dark speech, which in ancient Greek evokes an oracular heavenly voice. A curious idea emerges. Those voices Creon has banished are precisely those he must listen to. Let's continue with Haman's words. And I've partially analyzed this one, quote 10. Do not then bear one mood in yourself, not think that your word and no other must be right. For if any man thinks that he alone is wise, that in speech or in mind he has no peer, such a soul when laid open is always found empty. No, even when a man is wise, it brings him no shame to learn many things and not to be too rigid. For if even from me, a younger man, a worthy thought may be supplied, by far the best thing I believe would be for men to be all wise by nature. Otherwise, since most often it does not turn out that way, it's good to learn in addition from those who advise you well. Haman articulates a most compelling argument. One can never be too sure, both in speech and thought, that one is always right, which points to the necessity of listening, learning, and taking counsel. Wisdom is not a self-willed act of thinking and saying, but a stepping outside of the monological self. There is nothing like too much wisdom. Even when a man is wise, or so far Haman emphasizes, there is no shame in listening and learning from those who advise well, or more literally, those who say good and right things. Leondon. The metaphor for learning here is flexing one's reason properly and not straining it too tightly, or tomitenin ahan. According to the quoted passage, the right kind of reason not only knows how to give counsel, but also knows how to take it. This, I think, is strikingly delineated in the language Creon uses at the dramatic point of recognition in the play when he despairs at the terrible catastrophe he has engendered, admitting the flaw in his thinking reasoning. The word he uses to denote this tragic flaw is amartima, which also denotes a sin committed by not observing the godly virtue of Phronesis. Quote, the blunders of an unthinking mind, blunders of rigidity, yielding death. Oh, you witnesses of the killers and the killed, both of one family, what misery arises from my reasonings. Haman, you have died after a young life, youngest and last of my sons. Oh God, you have departed not by your foolishness, but my own. Creon attributes the blunders or the flaws, amartimata, to the unthinking mind, or in the original Greek, phrenon dis phronon. In mirroring one another, phrenon dis phronon, these two consonant words emphasize the failure in reason, phrenas, reasoning, or phronin, or wisdom, phronesis. The adjective unthinking, this phronon, implies the senselessness or foolishness of reason gone wrong, and is reinforced with another reference at the end of the passage where Creon admits his son died because of his foolishness, or here referred to as dysvoulias. Dysvoulias. In the original Greek, dysvoulias more precisely refers to ill counsel, implying that Creon's reason has been counseled in an ill manner. But what is the provenance of this ill counsel, if not Creon's very own reason? We know from the play that Creon has refused, indeed banished the good counsel of Antigone, Human, the seer, the messenger, and even the poetically brilliant and politically ambivalent chorus, who only express their doubts about Creon's injustice towards the end. More fundamentally, Creon has denied the good counsel of the rumors in the dark, or the dark speech, eremni fatis. The ill counsel at stake must derive from the monological nature of Creon's reason. Having failed to take counsel from the other, it is self-counsel and therefore ill reason. When Creon cries out, "What misery arises from my reasonings?" the word he uses for such reasonings is voulevmaton, here voulevmaton, okay, which refers both to giving counsel and taking counsel. If Creon's use of reason in this instance, his political resolution, has been unblessed or wretched, anolva, this is because he has not stepped beyond the confines of his self in order to get involved in the give and take of reasoning counsel. A particular moment in the play, which invokes the exact shape and form of counseling I've been evoking, is the dramatic exchange between Creon and his son. The exchange takes place right after Human has respectfully told his father about his injustice and the dark rumors. The chorus, somewhat emboldened by Human's brave delivery, urged Creon to take his counsel without offending him. Okay, this is what the chorus says, sorry. My king, it is right. If Human speaks something appropriate, that you should learn from him, and that you in turn, Human, should learn matin from your father. On both sides have been wise words. This is a call to the give and take of counsel, which involves acts of saying and learning, lein and matin. The following appears to be a counseling session where Creon asks one question after another, and Human briskly responds. One would expect that Creon would be predisposed to take Human's counsel, even when such counsel involves a measure of confrontation with the other. Yet all the questions that Creon asks are strictly rhetorical ones, their answers being monologically predetermined. Creon is blatantly sarcastic, arrogant, and aggressive. He will only say and will not learn. What is supposed to be an instance of counsel where Creon must confront the measure of the other immediately devolves into mock counsel and non-listening confrontation. Here is the beginning of the failed counsel between Creon and Human. Creon, men of my age, are we then to be schooled in wisdom by men of his, meaning by men of Human's age, not in anything that is not right, but if I am young, you should look to my conduct, not to my years. Creon's rhetorical question reveals his reluctance to be schooled, or more precisely, taught, didasko, regarding the use of reason, phronin, by a younger person. Human gives a perfect answer, implying that it is justness or dikeon, and not age that counts for the counsel's adequacy. To the extent that Human is on the side of Antigone, isn't he also on the side of disruptors? which our contemporary political discourse has come to name anarchists. And this is another quote from Creon. Is it worthy conduct to honor disruptors or akosmundas? Human, I could not urge anyone to show respect for the wicked or kakus. Is she not in the grasp is Antigone not in the grasp of that disease? All the people of this city of Thebes deny it. Creon accuses Human of honoring the discourse of the disruptor. The disruptor here is more precisely the discourse of the one that has negated the order of the world, akosmos, introducing the disorderly measure and potential counsel of the other. Human knows that Creon's talk on disruption and disorderliness is empty rhetoric as long as it does not concern itself with questions of ethics. One may certainly honor the disruptor as long as he's not wicked or kakus. There might indeed be disruptors, as Human implies, that say and do the right things as Antigone has done, and Creon must be just to them. Creon, however, frames Antigone as being sick or noso with wickedness, a sickness that also connotes disorder and sedition. In the rest of the failed counsel, he falls back into his characteristic monological reasoning. And the last quote, shall Thebes prescribe to me how I must rule, asks Creon, and Human answers, see there how you have spoken so much like a child. Creon, am I to rule this land by the will of another than myself? Human, there is no city which belongs to one man. Creon, does not the city by tradition belong to the man in power? Human, you would make a fine monarch in a desert. You would actually rule well in a desert, or arkin monos. Creon does not place the rule of the city in the moment of counsel as it is given or taken. The rule he assumes must issue either from his own will or the will of another, with no middle space in between. In Sir Richard Jebb's wonderful translation, Human sees this monological Creon ironically as a fine monarch in a desert. Fine monarch in a desert. The only place Creon can rule well is a desert where there are no others, hence no opposition or need for counsel. I am reminded here of Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, one of my favorite poems, where the poet learns about the statue of an ancient monarch, the King of Kings, all broken and buried in the sands of a vast desert. Furthermore, monarch appears as a perfect translation in that the etymology of the word is precisely the same as archin monos, monoarch, monarch. But I think the more contemporary sense of monarch, which refers to hereditary rule, somewhat restricts the wider suggestions of Human's critique directed not at any particular system of rule, such as monarchy, but at a particular way of ruling. The last line translates more precisely as, you would do well as the sole ruler of a desolate land, or even more literally as, you would rule solitarily well a desolate land. Such solitariness must be understood primarily in relation to Creon's refusal to take counsel. The play critiques solitary rule, or archin monos, in the same way as it critiques solitary reason, phronin monos. The two lines of critique are naturally interconnected. Solitary reason results in solitary rule. The metaphors also converge. The desolate land of solitary rule, its desert, resonates with the empty soul of solitary reason. Now I've come to my conclusion. It is possible then to formulate a more general argument based on Antigone, as long as godly justice is not self-evident and must arise from the workings of our own mortal faculty of reason. We cannot base our reasonings monologically on the powers of the solitary self. Rather, reason must be constituted as an inclusive dialogical exchange where counsels are given and taken. It's clear that such an exchange would involve the multiple counsels of multiple parties. Yet this is no anodyne exchange, no spiritless negotiation of ideas, no quick fix of conflict. A second argument might then be formulated in order to score a more dramatic moment in the constitution of counseling non-solitary reason, one that involves an argument that involves a stronger or more radical sense of opposition. I would argue that it is the unexpected confrontation with the other, often unseen and unheard, that might both liberate and elevate reason. In Creon's case, this involves a reckoning and counseling with Antigone, but also a confrontation with the memory of Antigone's dead brother, whom Creon has deemed an enemy and a traitor. Reason must be able to take the counsel of the dark speech it has shut in, repressed, or banished. A rigorous sense of reason would then be founded on the work of a counseling confrontation, or a confrontational counseling, where one opens oneself to the counsel of the ones one has hitherto shut off and away, including the counsel of those so-called enemies, traitors, or disruptors. It is through the non-solitary workings of this counseling reason in our administrators' governance that we may hope to achieve a more just justice and a more democratic democracy. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ahmet, for this very deep and inspiring talk.
I actually wanted to also read like Ozymandias as the last, because I refer to Ozymandias in relation to Creon. Can I just read it? It's just like a few lines. Is that okay?
Oh, if you like.
All right. Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculpture, well, those passions red, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, you mighty in despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." It's a desert. All right, thank you very much.
One of my favorite poems. Okay, everybody, any questions or comments for Ahmet Hoca? No questions? Let me check the mailbox, chat box.
Hi.
Oh, yeah, okay, Jeff, we hear you.
Hi, Ahmet. Thank you very much for very interesting talk about a subject that we know, but also don't know, and illuminating new aspects for us. Thank you very much. I think if I have a question, it's related to, can you do something for me that I didn't understand, and could you illuminate something for me? Could you talk a little bit, and you probably talk about this a lot elsewhere, because I know this is your project, about, excuse me, the explicit relation to European Union values through Antigone? That would just help me a little bit to make the connection between Antigone a little more explicit. Could you do that for me?
Yeah, sure. Not actually seeing myself, but in fact, I mean, what I'm trying to claim is that, you know, when we read these texts, ancient texts like Antigone, we're not necessarily thinking about the political, we're not only thinking about the political time or the historical time in which these texts were read or performed in Antigone's case, but also, we're actually thinking about the question of justice, for example, and democracy, right? And, when we look at the foundational texts of the European Union, such as the Lisbon Treaty or the Charter of Fundamental Rights, it's precisely these things that they're talking about, right? Like the EU is supposed to be based on things like, on values like justice and democracy, right? But what is lacking in that is, of course, an understanding of what justice is or what democracy is or what equality is. And, how are we going to get that idea? How are we going to form our own ideas of democracy or justice, right? And, my claim is, it's actually, we can do that by way of, looking at literature and the arts. And, these are actually sources of value for thinking about our world and for thinking about like a political union, just like the EU, right? And it's, when we look at Antigone, we see, Antigone is actually talking about how our administration should be like, what kind of practices of governance should be in our governments, right? And how reason must be used in governments, and in order to, of course, achieve the end of justice, right? And it's actually a very, very important aspect of the EU. Obviously, what justice is, how justice should be achieved, and and in this paper, that's exactly what I'm investigating. I'm looking at how justice is to be attained not by solitary reason, but something I call dialogical reason or non-solitary reason, and that's how I'm drawing the bridge between the kind of values that are mentioned in EU documents and ancient texts like Antigone.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
Which is, you have a very good reading of Creon as a bad leader, and I think that's it's not controversial, that one. I'm just interested about Antigone. Do you see Antigone as a martyr to justice?
I actually kind of do see her as a martyr of justice, right? In the first drafts of this paper, I was actually looking at Antigone in a less positive way, because Antigone is in absolute opposition with Creon, and she seems not to be listening to her own opposition, and that to me meant something quite negative. But ultimately, I kind of like changed my ideas, because I think she has her own sense of justice, and it's that sense of justice that's leading her to her acts of defiance, and she doesn't have to reason. She just has to have that kind of like sense of justice, and she does have that, and to the extent that she has that and she acts accordingly, yeah, why not? Of course, the word martyr is very charged. I don't know whether you should, we should be using that word frequently in any context. But I do see her as a fighter for justice overall. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, I would like to ask you a question,
Can I ask a question, which is kind of stupid, maybe? I just thought, this confrontational encounter. Did you say, Ahmet, was it confrontational encounter that takes place between?
Yeah, it's like I'm talking about counseling, but I'm not talking about this kind of.
Okay, so my question is, do you think this takes place in Antigone, or is it something that you can see in almost all the Greek tragedies? Because there's always this do that and don't do that coming from choir, and there's always a confrontational conversation going on. So do you find something peculiar in Antigone, or do you think this may be extended to other plays as well?
Yeah, I guess this might be expanded to other place. I in fact looked at the word counsel, and I see the merits of counseling. Obviously, that's what I want to emphasize in this presentation, the merits of counseling. But that, ultimately, when you agree to be counseled by the other, you have to also agree to have a kind of confrontation, and that's something that's in the nature of counseling. And it's also quite important that you take something that I've been emphasizing is you take the counsel of the dark speech, right? The speech that you have shut in or shut away or shut off from your sight, right? And that includes a kind of confrontation, obviously, and that confrontation is is shattering, right? It shatters the monopoly or monology of the solitary reason. So it has to open up to other ideas. I haven't, to be honest, I haven't looked at the way that idea is conveyed in other places. But of course, there's always that kind of lesson, that's there in ancient Greek plays. But I was actually looking at that idea of confrontation by way of the word counsel, right? A counseling confrontation is what I'm focusing on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Ahmet? If not, I want to thank you all for coming. I'm wishing you all a happy new year.
Dear Evren Hocam, I have a question to Ahmet Hoca.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, Hocam, thank you for this conference. And first of all, I read Antigone 2 years ago, and thanks to you, I refreshed my memory again about this. Do you think that this injustice moment towards Antigone is about her gender in that male society position, or it is the real about the justice that about democracy?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you, Peg. I think it's a great question. I think it's both, right? Reason is, by Creon, reason is defined as being extremely masculine, right? It's something that's exercised by men, and those who oppose him, use their reason in the wrong way, and actually, those that resist him are, in this place it's a woman, but also, when you use your reason against Creon, you experience a degradation of your reason according to Creon. You become feminine, right? So in that sense, it's quite sexist. You're right. It's about sexism, but that kind of sexism is also related to the idea that you do not want to communicate with the other. You don't want to take counsel from the other, right? In that sense, it's also related to the ideas of justice and democracy, right? So it's a couple of different things that we might think about in ways that are inclusive, right?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peg. If there are no other questions, I just want to thank you, Ahmet, again, and thank you all for joining us today. Wishing you all a happy new year once again. So thanks, and see you next year. Bye.
Bye.